Welcome to the Media Leader Podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. Everyone wants to reach young consumers. It feels like there's always a new report coming out about where to reach Gen Z and how to speak to them. The same is already becoming true of Gen Alpha, and was doubtless true just a handful of years ago when everyone wanted to understand why millennials were killing various micro-industries. Earlier this month on the podcast, I spoke with Hasbro's global heads of media to get the perspective of one brand with a vested interest in speaking to younger cohorts. And last week, I also prodded Channel 4 about its own research into Gen Z. But I wanted to go further, so consider this sort of like an informal summer series. Kate O'Loughlin is CEO of SuperAwesome, a company that offers ad and gaming products, audience insights, and compliance capabilities for marketers wanting to reach the next generation of consumers. Formerly owned by Epic Games, SuperAwesome was acquired by its own leadership at the beginning of last year. O'Loughlin and I spoke about what sets younger consumers apart, how to reach them in gaming environments and on social platforms, and importantly, how to do so in a way that is respectful of their privacy and user safety. This is that conversation I hope you enjoy. Kate O'Loughlin, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I like to start these interviews by asking how you got into media. I'm minded to believe you might have an especially interesting answer because you used to work at Lockheed Martin. Is that correct?
Yeah, Lockheed Martin. Yeah, it's this big systems integrator that does a lot of work for governments around the world.
So how did you go from that into the ad and media industry?
Do you remember when it was really in vogue for every ad tech and media company to say we have an astrophysicist on staff?
Yes.
It was like a thing for a while. Well, I wasn't that. That was the incomparable Ari Buchalter, who was like a legitimate astrophysicist at media math when I came into the industry. But I was attracted to a career change, going from a systems engineer into media because I was really quite intrigued by how data was going to be brought to a new industry. So this is back like before even programmatic was a word, but things were moving much faster than they could move when I was building things for the government. And so I had cold emailed a company that I'd saw, I think, written up in the New York Times to ask if I could please move to Manhattan and work for their kind of cool media data company. And for reasons I still don't understand, they said yes. So I joined Media Math back in 2008 as a technical product manager, working as the first product manager on Terminal One, which was one of the original DSPs in the world. I was there for a few years before I went to TapAd, because just as like all consumers had mobile devices, but didn't really know how to transact with brands or media on them, on those smaller devices. So I went there, eventually becoming the general manager of the media business for based on identity resolution and how you connect what someone is doing on one screen to their other screens. I was there about 7.5 years, leading the media business, as I said, up through acquisition by Telenor. And then I came over to SuperAwesome to really undo all of the data collection that I had done in those other two companies, first to help on US expansion, then became global COO whilst we were under ownership by Epic Games, the maker of Fortnite, and became CEO in August of 2023, just as we MBO'd and came out of Epic as an independent company with Epic as our investor instead of our owner.
So what attracted you to SuperAwesome in the first place?
Well, I had never come across a company in ad tech that was specifically focused on a quarter of the world's population in kids and teens. I thought it was, when I had heard the idea and when they reached out, I thought it was a really unique way of building things for what I understood to be a really important audience at the time, because I had little kids in my house and I knew how much they influenced basically every decision we made as a family, what we buy, where we go, what we wear, how we drive, everything is influenced by them. But I couldn't think of any company that was catered specifically to them and what makes them unique and the requirements to keep them safe and seeing things that are appropriate for them online. So I thought it was like a very interesting, unique, hard problem to solve. It was also quite mission driven, which was really interesting.
Can you take me through a little bit of the sort of post-Epic ownership era? What's been the strategy for growth? Has it changed at all since they are no longer the 100% owner of the company? Or the main investor?
It hasn't. It really hasn't changed. We're focused specifically on solving for kids and teens. what we learned inside of Epic was just an absolute masterclass in the importance of connecting with consumers in sort of the new era of digital in immersive experiences. I know metaverse hype is sort of kind of run its course at the moment, but there really is still a huge mismatch between what many players and people are doing inside of these really cool new immersive gaming experiences and how much recognition and frankly brand spend is going there. So we learned so much, saw what was going on there, and then we've incorporated that into the bigger mission of connecting and engaging with kids and teens wherever they are. And that doesn't include gaming, of course, but it's still, streaming, social video, YouTube, mobile gaming, and really they're doing everything everywhere all at once. And so that's our strategy, is to connect with them where they are, always doing it in a way that is safe and compliant. That will always be the bedrock. But we're really now solving for what is a big data scarcity problem among kids and teens. Obviously, there's data privacy laws that prevent, data collection about who is an individual and what is a single person doing behaviorally. And that's really created this sort of like desert of information about kids and teens. And we're stepping in to try to solve that in a way that's safe and compliant always, but really try to get to understanding who they are, what are their fandoms, what drives them, what's their interests, so that as an ecosystem, not only could we, connect with them as brands and agencies, but more as importantly, build really great inclusive content for them. We feel that when kids and teens are left behind, that's when things become unsafe. And so we want to keep fueling this more inclusive way of thinking about them, and doing that from the point of view of kind of funding the ecosystem in a way that says yes to kids and teens.
What mistakes do you often see brands or advertisers making when they're trying to target Gen Z or Gen Alpha?
I think some of the mistakes that we see are treating them as one big homogenous blob. Very frequently, almost all the time, whenever we get a media brief for kids or teens, it'll be like, we want to reach girls 5 to 12. Well, that doesn't really mean anything, because if you think about a 5-year-old, they're just learning how to read. They're really quite, dominated by the internal family dynamic. They're just they're just building their own personalities that are a very different life stage than a kid who's 12 and is pubescent and very interested in, like love interests are coming along, and they're very much dominated by the social dynamic, and they're just not even the same species, really.
And the media consumption habits must be so different. I mean, even myself as a sort of older Gen Z is very different from someone just a couple years younger than me in terms of how I consume media.
Absolutely. And I think that's one mistake that brands make, is they don't recognize the difference it's a very small window of time, that 5 to 12 or 12 to 16 or 16 to 18, but so much happens, and to treat them all the same is a mistake, as well as, even treating every 12-year-old as though they're the same. There's a very big difference between someone who's a Billie Eilish fan from a Taylor Swift fan, and sort of not recognizing that those unique features and drivers is often, is a thing that we're trying to help improve.
Would you say generational targeting is even generally useful, given that the cohort looks very different? I mean, I suppose this is true of any generation. It's not just unique to younger people either. Is that the right way to go about things?
Yeah, I do think that generational targeting has its place, because you sort of see large parts of society affected by lots of externalities, right? Like kids that are born now, now we're in Gen Beta, actually. This is the first year of Gen Beta. But Gen Alpha from last year through, who they're now about 15 years old or so. They will never know a world without AI. And AI is part of how they learn, how they socialize, how they entertained. They're entertained. Like, this is their reality. And so that is useful information and context to have when you think about creating, an approach to them or to connect with that audience.
So you mentioned the importance of, user safety. I'm sure brand safety is also very important, especially for any brand trying to target young people.
Yep.
These topics come up often as sort of significant concerns for a lot of the platforms that I'm sure you work with, whether they be social media platforms, Roblox as a major gaming platform. How do you work to reach young people safely in those environments?
Well, there's several different components. So first, you have to worry about data privacy. So this is what kind of information are you collecting and using, and do you have permission to do that? And so one of the things that we make sure that, in media transactions, it's very rare for you to get the right kind of consent to collect personal information. And just remember, personal information has a stricter definition for kids and teens than it does for adults. And so you very rarely get the right kind of consent to do things like retargeting. You're just not going to get that en masse. And so what we do is make sure that there isn't PI leakage in an ad transaction. Neither is like the publisher or the developer or the content creator pushing up information that they shouldn't be sending into the media stream or into the ecosystem. And then likewise, when an advertiser places an ad, make sure that that the ad itself hasn't been stuffed with data collectors, as an example. And so that's one way in which we protect it, the data privacy component of it. But that's really just one part. Then the next part is you need to make sure that the experience is really in the best interest of the child. So you're not duping or tricking or otherwise taking advantage of the credulity of kids. They just often don't know, as an example, the difference between a paid opinion and a real opinion of an influencer. So you have to do things like having really well disclosed content. And making sure that there's no sort of harmful game loops. The age-appropriate design code, as an example, in the UK wants to make sure that you're not sort of dragging kids into a loop that they can't get out of and they don't know that they're in, that feels, sort of like gambling or loot boxes type of thing. And then lastly, really have to think about curating experiences that are appropriate for what they see, feel, and hear from the media itself. Now, you've got the Online Safety Act in the UK, the OSA, which is really about keeping kids out of extremely harmful stuff like porn, which obviously everybody wants to make sure is happening. But there's stuff that just is always at the line where you kind of help the kid and, frankly, the brand not be there. Things that's like extremely rude or extremely, like incentivizing the wrong kind of behaviors. And so you really have to look at it from several different lenses when it comes to teens and kids.
How do you manage the sort of different content moderation practices across different platforms? I mean, we saw Meta obviously made big changes at the start of this year. I imagine you've now had a couple months to think about how to integrate on a platform like Instagram maybe differently than you had been.
Yeah, it is a shame that some of the big platforms have stepped back from curation responsibilities. I think that's probably the step in the wrong direction, given the momentum of so many jurisdictions wanting and requiring the platforms to do more, not less. But I do think that it's expensive because it has to be humans and computers. I think that the machine learning gets you so far, but it doesn't, even like the best stuff doesn't really help you understand the nuance of appropriateness or not. And so I get it that it's, overhead, but it's, I think, not just a requirement, but it's the right thing to do.
Mm. What about the general issue of adjacency where, because different platforms, and I suppose this is less true of Roblox, but potentially true in terms of an adjacency issue, you don't really know what you're showing up against or next to in a lot of these environments because they're algorithmically tailored to an individual user. Your TikTok looks probably very different from my TikTok, just as one example, but it's true in all of these situations because, everyone's interacting with these AI-powered, machine learning-powered algorithms. So does that cause any distress when you're working with brands about, well, we want to have as much control over our placement if we're really trying to target a specific, younger population?
Yeah, I think that's why you have to start from looking at as wide a breadth of the content as possible and include stuff that is kind of vetted to be good when it comes to youth. And actually, it comes down to, really understanding who is the player or who is the user. And that brings us into sort of the requirements and the momentum to have better age verification in the world. the platforms and an advertiser and everybody in between can only do as well as who they really know to be the player.
How do you consider the current age verification issue? Because my understanding when I've talked to people in the past is the tech isn't necessarily there yet in terms of really being able to verify everyone's age while also being respectful of privacy. As to your point earlier, it's really important to make sure that people have some right to privacy online, but you can't do that while also having proper age verification where people definitely can't be lying. Do you want to get a driver's license or an ID upload? I mean, there's all these issues, right? So it seems to me this seems like a very challenging issue to try and address, and one that we're very far away from.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a little suspect of people saying the tech isn't there. I mean, I don't know if you've seen Prevo and a few of the other companies that do like age verification, facial verification. It's way better than any person trying to distinguish, is this person really 14 or 18? The technology is actually quite advanced and good. But I do think it does come down to this hot potato of liability and responsibility that hasn't been sorted. And it's quite interesting. I don't know if you saw that there's two bills now that have been passed in the US, one in Texas and one in Utah, that pushes age verification to the app stores and like sort of finally makes the decision for the ecosystem that no, Apple and Google, you're closest to the consumer and you're like the best single point of like understanding who they are before they get sent out into downloading different apps and different experiences. And I think that makes sense because it does make it easier for families to say, like, this is who my user actually is, no matter sort of where they show up on their device. It kind of puts out that hot potato. It puts it in the lap of Apple and Google, but
yeah,
let's see if it actually stands up in the courts.
Well, Mark Zuckerberg had been lobbying for that policy for, I think, many years, and I recall him suggesting it, explicitly in his various congressional meetings where he was grilled by, senators, generally people that don't necessarily understand the platforms especially well. So I'm sure it's positive for the platforms, but does Google and Apple know as much about users than the platforms? Because, I mean, the platforms can sort of suggest, based off of all the data around the people that are using them, how old a person probably is, and they keep that information on the back end.
Yeah, I do think that it's not going. I would be surprised if, say, the App Store is the one who tells you your age, tells a platform an age, but then the platform doesn't also have responsibility to say, well, that might have been one stated age, but actually based on the content, this is likely their age. And that's actually just what's sort of the root of the new Roku lawsuit in Michigan in the US. And so Roku is allegedly not distinguishing enough between kid users from the content that they're originating in. There's only one login on Roku. There isn't a split profile between an adult and a child, and therefore the Michigan Attorney General alleges that those kids originating from kids' content are being their data is being collected and used and sold in ways that aren't permitted. And so in that way, the platform Roku, they thought they had the age of the user potentially, but actually it was the content and what the user was actually watching at the point that the AG, the Attorney General, says is what rules whether or not you should be collecting collecting information, personal information.
So where do you see this all heading, I suppose? Are we heading in a direction that is generally safer for children, that's also respectful of, their ability and desire to be online in anonymous locations and accessing platforms at a reasonable, quote unquote, age?
I guess the unfulfilling maybe is the answer. I mean, I think where we're going is away from the traditional don't ask, don't tell who is your user and how old they are, to a place where, in many of the rules, there's even personal liability to an executive who disregards clues about who the user is. And so I think that that will incentivize, probably more from a stick, to try to make the experiences better for younger users. But I do think that there's still a missing carrot, if you like the financial incentives to make a more inclusive environment for kids and teens. And I think that's the thing that has to come along too, is that, people who make great experiences, developers, content creators, the platforms themselves, they have to have the tools to be able to safely monetize those players. Otherwise, they're just going to kind of keep pushing the issue off. And so, yes, there's tons of momentum on the stick side on legislation and expectation from the regulators, but the carrot is still needing to come.
And part of that is also that advertisers do they care as much? Would they prefer to support platforms or areas that are supposedly safer, or is it really just an effectiveness play? Like when you talk to clients, what's their big concern?
They know, or they have an inkling that younger users are important for their bottom line, but they're often missing the proof or the data or the insight to sort of get to that conclusion. Like you sort of intuit that Adidas and Nike want to be able to speak to a tween and a teen because they know that you decide if you're an Adidas man or Nike man. Adidas or Nike.
You're doing a good job translating for the British audience. I would say Nike and Adidas, and I'm leaving it at that.
Okay, great. But you decide if you're one of those loyalists, by the time you're 13 or 14. And same thing, you decide if you're a L'Oreal girl or a Revlon girl by the time you're 12, 13, 14. And so they understand that, but they're kind of missing okay, how do we prove it? Can we measure that there's a lifetime value associated with setting that loyalty and brand preference now? And frankly, it is getting harder to build that sense of fandom and loyalty because Gen Alpha and Gen Z are living in much, much more fragmented times in terms of what they do, where they go, what they connect with. We did this piece of research where we asked over 3,000 kids and teens, what are your top fandoms? And 76% of them came back and named a fandom that no one else in the survey named.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's
extremely different from if you had asked kids and teens, 12, 15 years ago, because they would have be driven by a much smaller set menu of content that was available on linear. But now they're watching 127 million different influencers, literally 127 million influencers now between TikTok and YouTube and the other social video platforms. There's just not one funnel of where IP is developed and where content is consumed. And so it's wildly fragmented. And that's hard for brands, is how do they connect with existing fandoms or how do they build their own because of this big fragmentation?
Yeah, the latest WPP Media, formerly Group M, report found that UGC is about to surpass professional content in terms of ad revenue against it globally. And to me, that's a really major shift. How do you make sure that a brand is showing up with the right creator? I mean, you do a lot of work with the creator economy, and I know that creators can be a challenge for brands to work with because that relationship is still in the process of professionalizing.
Yeah. I do think it's gotten better. When we first launched our creator and influencer business, we were still in the days where brands were sending out 1,000 product and then just sort of praying that someone would say something nice about them. And so it's gotten better than that, but still, that desire for an influencer and creator to really connect with their audience and have that editorial freedom and be able to move extremely fast is at odds with many of the brand and advertiser conventions of how they plan, how they create content. We actually had this really great creator named Hugh. He's got about 8 million followers. He came in and did a fireside for a big toy company. And on stage, he was just riffing amazing ideas, saying to this brand, all you need to do is put out a set that jumps on the Italian brain rot trend, and you will have, hundreds of millions of views. And it was a great set of ideas, but there's just no way that the brand could move fast enough to, produce, let alone get approvals to be able to move that fast. And so there's, there is still a mismatch between what the creators want to do and what the brands are able to do.
Is chasing trends generally a smart idea? Because we get lots of trend reports from all of the big platforms, and I usually don't know what to do with them, because by the time I'm getting a trend report, I know innately that the trend has probably already passed, or if it's extended, then it's becoming less and less cool over time. So by the time an advertisement's coming out to hop on, a trend, a TikTok trend like that, like whatever Italian brain rot is, I don't know what that is. Clearly, I'm
cappuccino
I'm
ballerina.
Yeah, I don't know. Skibbity toilet. I mean, we could name these things that make a lot of sense to young people in this sort of ironic humor type of way, but by the time that an ad exec is hearing about it, surely the time has passed, right?
Yes and no. I mean, the Skibbity toilet, it's got a James Cameron movie coming out.
And it's going to make lots of money.
Yes, it will. But some trends obviously are just going to fade and, be a 2-week meme and then disappear. What we try to do is actually understand what is the driver behind the trend. Why is it interesting? Why was it funny? What is sort of the through line of interest? And try to use that to then inform strategy that peaks over time. And that connects to, how we think trying to bring a more audience-based approach to kids and teens too, is looking at what drives them and how to look at that difference as an example between a Billie Eilish kid and Taylor Swift kid. Is a younger user driven by determination as a core value? And if your product connects with that value of determination, then you probably want to go start doing some advertising in obbies and obstacle courses in Roblox versus an RPG role-playing game. And so those are the through lines that we try to find and inform it by the trends. Like, this is the reason that Italian brain rot is funny and interesting. And this is what this means to then how you can feed it into a strategy that will, work for several weeks, months, and help you contribute into a fandom or IP development.
Talk to me more about gaming, because I've been writing about this industry for a couple of years now. I've been writing about gaming on and off for that amount of time as well. And even though there's been more money moving toward big gaming platforms, especially the Fortnites and Robloxes of the world, the channel is still often stuck on the sort of experimental budget at a lot of these agencies with their clients. And I'm curious how you think we can move that, or if we should move that on into a more consistent, prioritized investment.
I think it should be a consistent investment just because of time spent. I mean, this is exactly where we were in mobile, in 2011, 2012, all the consumers were there, and yet media hadn't caught up with it. So I think we're very much in that same time frame. But the lesson to learn from that time frame was also that you got to really know your role as a brand to jump into gaming. Remember when every brand wanted an app in the App Store, and you were like, Clorox, bro, you really don't need an app. You can advertise, in mobile in mobile experiences, but you don't need your own app. It's very much where we are now in gaming. Not every company, not every brand should have their own, map in Fortnite or game in Roblox, but there's probably a role for them to play in some kind of brand integration, or even just to do billboard or video advertising in these in Roblox especially. It just makes good sense because that's where the next generation of consumers are spending their social time and their creativity time, and that's where they have a lot of fun.
So many of the in-game advertising activations, whether it is building a world or just buying a billboard, some of those can be quite high cost. Obviously, less so if you're just buying a billboard, more so if you're developing an entire game. I know people can do that quickly now, and costs have come down over time. But still, that's generally upper funnel. I mean, unless, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems pretty upper funnel. So I'm curious, is there a challenge in proving the effectiveness of gaming that's sort of hurting the possibility of unlocking more investment?
Well, I've maybe 2 points of view on that. So one is that when we see a brand only do gaming, like only invest in the experience that they're building, that's where it goes awry. Like it really has to be part of a cohesive strategy that's in the experiences and then around the game too. So there's, taking content that you've made in Roblox and then working with influencers or creators to then connect that into social video where you get a ton of engagement and then use some of that to like then reflect back into your own consumer journey. Like that's where things start to really jive and work and make sense then to have gaming as part of the strategy. So I do think that it's a part of the funnel, right? But it has to be coordinated. And then second is I do think that it's going to become closer to mid and lower funnel as UGC sales and cosmetics and in-game experiences lead to purchase. The Roblox has done, announced their Shopify integration, but even, kids and teens care just as much about what their avatar is wearing as what they're wearing in real life. And so the connection between, sales of trainers back to Adidas and Nike, there'll be a digital version of that and your physical version of that. And those things probably will connect over time, but that really is taking you lower in the funnel, which I think is pretty cool and exciting.
What I'm also hearing is more parents need to make sure that their kids don't have unabated access to their credit cards.
Correct. Yeah. and it's wild how well financed kids and teens are themselves and how, like the pervasiveness of their own debit cards now, which, again, age verification, safety and control, and being able to have parents understand how these things are all working and see what purchase is happening. Safety has to be at the bedrock of everything here, but it's going to move pretty fast. And there's lots of opportunity ahead.
I imagine lots of clients often ask when it's appropriate to get into in-game advertising versus just say, doing a brand partnership with a Twitch streamer and then getting things around on different other social platforms that are maybe speaking to that audience, but in a different way, in a way that maybe they're a little bit more comfortable with because they've used before. How do you manage the conversation to decide for a brand what platforms are right and when?
It always is a conversation. We're trying to bring as much information and insight to that decision. It's almost really not about just the platform, like picking YouTube over Roblox. It needs to be about, well, who's the kind of person you're trying to reach and engage with? And then we'll figure out which kind of content matches up to them. And that is probably across multiple platforms. Coming back to this point about fragmentation, I mean, very few consumers are spending just all their time in one place. You really need to be in everywhere that they are and find like what is the content clues across those platforms to really reach them. And so it's rarely just about only do creators or only do Roblox. It's about how do we connect these things together.
So you're kind of on the cutting edge in a lot of ways in terms of trying to speak to younger consumers, safe, effective ways. I'm curious how you yourself are wanting to innovate at SuperAwesome. What things are you looking at over the next couple of years that you're wanting to do in order to grow your own client list in a couple of years' time?
First is just still always getting the industry to understand and acknowledge youth and the importance of them and how they influence or directly buy things themselves. And so bringing insight, measurement, et cetera, to help with that education will be a part of our innovation. I do think that figuring out how fandoms create and how loyalty progresses given the fragmentation of user behavior, we're going to spend a ton of time on that because it's really important for many brands and many AP. And it's not just about the marketing use case in that way. It's about like product development and IP licensing, et cetera. And then we're always going to have to stay, move at the pace of kids and teens to figure out where they are next. There's community development, I think, is the next big thing to sort. What's been driving the growth of Discord, what makes what role does community play next to entertainment and connection and commerce? I mean, there's so much to do, and that's going to change fast.
What do you think is driving growth for Discord?
I think that it's about making connection and having people really be able to explore and connect over interests, albeit them often quite micro interests.
Things that are hard to necessarily find community for, maybe in person within your local community. Yes. People are going online to find it.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, it's definitely interesting. There's lots of things to watch, but I think that's a great place to end it. Kate, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you about some really interesting topics for generations that I used to feel like I was a part of, but I guess I'm only technically a part of now, and there's clearly some things I need to do to update myself on their culture.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and great conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader Podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, Trisonic. You can find all our episodes wherever you get your podcasts or on our website at themedialeader.co.uk. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified when we release our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.